My name is Miriam, and I'm 62 years old. I never thought I'd live to hear my own son-in-law call me too weak. Those words didn't just sting, they echoed inside me like a cold slap that refused to fade. I've always believed that strength isn't something you shout about. It's what you show quietly, day after day. But that night, Brandon, my daughter's husband, made me question if my calmness had been mistaken for fragility. After my husband Harold passed away 5 years ago, I promised myself to keep the family close. Harold was a disciplined man, the kind who planned every dollar, every dinner, every family trip with precision. When he died, it felt like someone had turned the volume down on my life. The silence in our home was unbearable. But my daughter, Isla, filled some of that void. She was my joy, my only child. When she met Brandon, I thought I was seeing her step into a fairy tale. Handsome, charming, polite. He treated her like the world revolved around her, and I wanted to believe it did. At first, Brandon was everything a mother could hope for in a son-in-law. He brought me flowers when he came over, helped around the house, and always called me Mom. But charm, I've learned, can be a mask that hides something darker. Slowly, he started showing his true self first through small jabs. Little comments about how old-fashioned I was or how Isla needed to live more modernly. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just his way of teasing. The real change came after they married. Brandon began controlling everything: how Isla spent money, what she wore, even who she saw. My once vibrant daughter started dimming, as if someone had lowered her brightness. Whenever I brought it up, Isla would defend him. "He's just protective, Mom," she'd say, smiling in that strained way that mothers recognize too well. I knew she was covering something, but I didn't want to push her away. Still, Brandon's tone toward me shifted from polite to condescending. He began calling me ma'am instead of mom, like I was a stranger. If I offered advice about home repairs or budgeting, he'd smirk and say, "You wouldn't understand, Miriam, it's different now." That line became his favorite excuse for every disrespectful remark. Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was a simple Sunday meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a bottle of wine. Isla looked tired, but I pretended not to notice. I asked how work was going, and Brandon launched into a long story about how his new business idea was too advanced for old people to understand. He laughed. When I teased back, saying that experience often beats youth, he leaned back in his chair, grinning like a boy who'd won an argument. "You're too weak to manage anything now, Miriam. That's just the truth. You should stop worrying about business or money. You've had your time." The room went silent. Isla froze. My fork hovered halfway to my mouth, my hand trembling just slightly. I saw in his eyes that he wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to make me feel small. And what hurt most wasn't his words, it was my daughter's silence. Isla didn't defend me. She just stared at her plate, her eyes glossy, her lips pressed tight. I excused myself and went into the kitchen. The smell of roast chicken suddenly made me nauseous. I held the edge of the counter, steadying my breath. 62 years old, retired nurse, widow, and mother too weak? I'd worked double shifts in my 20s, paid off a mortgage in my 40s, and cared for my dying husband without ever asking for help. If that was weakness, then the world had forgotten what strength really looked like. I returned to the dining room, calm as a still lake. "Thank you for dinner," I said softly, even though I'd cooked it myself. Brandon looked smug, thinking he'd put me in my place. Isla mumbled something about cleaning up, and I waved her off. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll handle it." He smirked again. "See? Always taking care of everything yourself. You really should let go, Miriam." I smiled. "Oh, Brandon," I said gently. "I will. Sooner than you think." He laughed, thinking it was a joke. But I meant it. That night, after they left, I sat alone by the window. The moonlight poured across the room, touching Harold's old photo on the mantel. His smile seemed to tell me he understood. "Too weak," I whispered, repeating Brandon's words. My reflection in the glass looked back at me, not weak, just quiet. Quiet can be mistaken for weakness, but it's where strength begins. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just started thinking, planning, remembering things Harold used to say about self-respect and protection. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote in my journal, "He thinks I'm weak. He has no idea who he's dealing with." It was the first time in a long while I felt the familiar spark of control returning. Brandon had no idea that the woman he insulted had once faced far worse and survived it all. That night, I realized something important: people like him only respect power they can see. So I would show him mine, not through anger but through action. Miriam quietly decided that night that Brandon's arrogance would not go unanswered. I used to see my daughter every weekend until Brandon made sure she stopped visiting. It started so subtly that I didn't even notice it happening at first. Isla and I had always had our little Saturday ritual tea in the garden, sharing stories, laughing about old memories of Harold forgetting anniversaries or overcooking steaks. But after she married Brandon, the visits grew fewer, the calls shorter, and the laughter, well, that disappeared altogether. At first, it was, "Mom, we're busy this weekend," or, "Brandon's parents are coming over, maybe next time." I understood. Newlyweds have lives to build, habits to form. But soon, next time turned into weeks, and then months. When she did come, Brandon always tagged along, hovering like a shadow. He never let Isla stay alone with me anymore. Even when I tried to get a private word in, he'd find a reason to interrupt, checking his phone loudly, suggesting they leave early, or acting impatient if our conversation lasted more than 10 minutes. One day, I invited them for lunch. I cooked Isla's favorite shepherd's pie and set the table beautifully, with the same embroidered cloth she and I had picked out years ago. They arrived an hour late. Isla looked drained, her smile forced, while Brandon walked in with that fake charm pasted across his face. He kissed me on the cheek, told me how lovely everything looked, then immediately commented that my house was too big for one person. I laughed it off, but his tone lingered in my mind long after they left. The next morning, Isla called to say Brandon thought I should downsize, that I'd be happier in a smaller place. The phrasing didn't sound like her, it was him speaking through her voice. I knew what he was doing, isolating her, one step at a time. Brandon's control wasn't loud, it was strategic. He'd compliment her, then correct her. He'd let her make small choices, then dismiss her ideas when it came to bigger ones. "You don't know much about money, babe," he'd say. "I'll handle it." Soon after, Isla mentioned that they'd merged finances. I didn't question it directly, but I saw the unease flicker across her face when I asked if that was really what she wanted. As months went on, her tone over the phone changed. The warmth faded. Conversations became stiff, rehearsed. If I mentioned Brandon, her voice would go quiet, as if she were afraid to say the wrong thing. Once, I suggested we go on a short mother-daughter trip, just the two of us like we used to. She hesitated and, it said, Brandon wouldn't like that. That one sentence broke my heart. When did she start needing his permission to see her own mother? I confided in my old friend Denise, who had known Isla since she was a baby. We met at our usual cafe, the one with the chipped mugs and the smell of cinnamon in the air. I told her everything about the distance, the change, the control. Denise didn't even blink. "You need to be careful," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Men like that don't stop until they isolate their victims completely. Write things down, Miriam. Keep a record of everything." At first, I didn't want to believe her. It felt too paranoid, too extreme. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Brandon had a way of twisting stories, of making Isla think I was the problem. He once told her I was too emotional to handle finances and suggested he should help me manage my bills. The audacity. So I started keeping a small notebook, hidden in my sewing drawer. Every time Brandon said something condescending, every change I noticed in Isla's behavior, every visit canceled, I wrote it down. Not out of spite, but out of instinct. I'd learned during my nursing years that documentation is power. If something went wrong, you needed proof, not feelings, proof. Around that time, Brandon began dropping by unannounced under the guise of helping out. One afternoon, he showed up saying he'd check the gutters. I didn't ask for his help, but he insisted. When I offered him lemonade, he smiled and said, "You really shouldn't be climbing ladders at your age, Miriam. You could get hurt." The way he said, "at your age," made my stomach turn. It wasn't concern, it was condescension wrapped in false kindness. He started handling little tasks, like calling my handyman or paying small bills, claiming it was no trouble. But I noticed a pattern: he wanted access, information. He asked questions about my property, about my husband's life insurance, even about the lawyer Harold and I used years ago. Each question felt like a line being crossed. I pretended not to notice, but I kept my answers vague. Then, one afternoon, I overheard something I wasn't meant to. Isla had left her phone on speaker when she called me, and I heard Brandon in the background say, "Your mom's gonna need us soon. She's slowing down. Don't worry, she won't be a problem." Isla shushed him, but my chest tightened. Not be a problem? As if I were some obstacle to be managed? That night, I sat in my living room, holding that notebook, feeling the weight of every word inside it. Each line was proof of how far he'd gone to control both of us. I realized that he wasn't just manipulating my daughter, he was trying to erase me from her life entirely. So I stopped trying to please him. I stopped calling as often, stopped offering help, stopped letting him think I needed his approval. But I didn't confront him. Not yet. I knew his kind. They feed on reaction, on resistance. I would give him neither. Instead, I would watch, record, and wait. Miriam starts quietly keeping notes because she senses something ugly is brewing. It was my late husband's birthday when Brandon finally showed his true face. Every year, on that day, I held a quiet dinner at my house, a small, intimate gathering meant to honor Harold's memory. It wasn't a sad ritual, it was my way of keeping him close. I'd cook his favorite meal, pot roast with rosemary, mashed potatoes, and steamed vegetables, and light a single candle beside his photograph on the mantel. For years it had been just Isla and me. But since she'd married Brandon, he'd insisted on attending too. Family should be together, he'd say, though I could tell he never meant it. That year, I decided to host the dinner again, even though things had become tense. I spent the whole morning preparing. I pulled out Harold's old record player, polished the silverware, and even ironed the tablecloth, just as he liked it. The air smelled of rosemary and butter, and for a brief moment, I felt peace until the clock struck 7 and they still hadn't arrived. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Isla's face was pale. Brandon strolled in with his usual swagger, holding a bottle of wine like a trophy. "Sorry, we're late," he said. Traffic was insane. Isla didn't speak. She just gave me a small, apologetic smile and helped set the table. We sat down, and I tried to steer the conversation toward memories of Harold, how he used to whistle off-key while cooking, how he'd laugh at his own jokes before finishing them. But Brandon interrupted me every time, turning the topic back to himself. He bragged about a new business opportunity, about how he'd soon be earning more than most people his age. When I congratulated him, he smirked and said, "You wouldn't really understand the kind of deals I'm working on, Miriam. It's pretty high-level stuff." I smiled politely, though I could feel my pulse rising. Isla stayed quiet, her fork barely touching her plate. I tried to make her laugh, telling her about the time Harold accidentally glued his sleeve to a cabinet door, but even then, Brandon cut in with, "Sounds like he wasn't very handy, huh?" The air shifted. The warmth of the meal evaporated, replaced by something cold and sharp. I put my fork down. "He was handy enough to build this house with his own 2 hands, I said calmly. Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Relax, Miriam. It's just a joke. You're too sensitive sometimes." I caught Isla's eyes, searching for support, but she just looked down, pushing food around her plate. My heart sank. I could see how much control he had over her, how carefully she avoided doing anything that might set him off. When dessert came out, Harold's favorite chocolate cake, I thought, maybe we could end the night peacefully. I sliced 3 pieces and set one in front of each of them. Brandon took a bite and frowned. "A bit dry, don't you think?" I froze. It wasn't about the cake. It was the tone. Dismissive, deliberate, designed to wound. I forced a smile. "Well, I tried my best," he chuckled. "You really should rest more. You're too weak to handle all this cooking and cleaning, Miriam. You should enjoy your golden years instead of pretending you can still manage everything." Too weak. There it was again. The same poison, disguised as advice. Isla's fork clattered against her plate. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. I took a slow breath. My heart felt like it was cracking open, not from his insult but from my daughter's silence. I looked at her and saw the young girl who used to run to me after school, hair tangled, arms full of books, always laughing. Now she sat across from me, shrinking smaller with every word he said. I set my napkin on the table. "Brandon," I said quietly, "that's enough." He tilted his head, mock confusion on his face. "Enough of what?" "Enough of the disrespect," I replied, my voice steady. "This is not your house. This is my table, and I will not have you speak to me that way in front of my daughter." He smirked. That same condescending smile I'd come to hate. Oh, come on, Miriam. Don't take it so seriously. You're overreacting. I'm just being honest. Honest. That's what bullies always say when they enjoy hurting people. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. If that's your version of honesty, you can leave. The room went silent. Isla looked terrified. Brandon's jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought he'd argue, but instead, he laughed, shaking his head. You can't make anyone do anything, Miriam. You're too weak for that. His words sliced through the air. I saw Isla flinch. I didn't respond. Instead, I looked at him the way I used to look at patients who refused to take advice that could save their lives with quiet pity. Then I turned away and began clearing the plates. No one spoke. Brandon mumbled something about not meaning it that way, but I didn't listen. Isla excused herself, rushing to the bathroom, tears in her eyes. I heard the door close softly behind her. When she came out, her face was pale, her voice shaky. We should go, she whispered. Brandon shrugged, grabbed his jacket, and sauntered toward the door like nothing had happened. When the front door shut, the silence was deafening. I stood in the living room, looking at Harold's photograph. His smile seemed different that night, firmer, knowing. I sat down, feeling the weight of years pressing on me. That dinner wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a turning point. I realized that no matter how kind I'd been, how accommodating, it would never be enough for a man who thrived on control. I washed the dishes quietly, my hands trembling only once when I picked up Brandon's untouched piece of cake and threw it straight into the trash. It felt symbolic, like I was discarding the last bit of tolerance I had left for him. I sat back down at the table, staring at the flickering candle by Harold's picture. He called me weak, I whispered to the empty room. But I think he just made the biggest mistake of his life. The candle flame danced, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something stir deep inside me, a strength I hadn't realized I'd lost. That night, Miriam vows to reclaim her dignity and her family's respect, no matter what it takes. I couldn't sleep that night, so I opened my husband's old safe, and what I found changed everything. The clock had just passed midnight when I got out of bed. My heart was still racing from the memory of Brandon's words, echoing like a cruel refrain in my mind. The house was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp in the hallway. I made my way to Harold's study, a room I hadn't entered in months. Dust covered the shelves, and the faint scent of his cologne still lingered in the air. For years, Harold's desk had been left untouched. His papers were neatly stacked, his old fountain pen lying exactly where he'd left it. I sat down in his chair, running my fingers over the worn leather armrests. It was there, under the bottom drawer, that he'd hidden the small steel safe. I remembered the combination by heart: his birthday, our anniversary, and Isla's birth year. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the dial, each click sounding louder in the stillness of the house. When the safe opened, I found a small stack of envelopes, each carefully labeled in Harold's neat handwriting. There were bank documents, insurance papers, and one envelope marked, "For Miriam, if anything happens to me." I hadn't seen that before. My chest tightened as I picked it up, the paper fragile under my fingertips. Inside was a letter dated nearly 10 years earlier. I unfolded it and began to read. He wrote about his worries, about how he feared certain people might try to take advantage of me after he was gone. "You have a kind heart," he wrote. "But kindness is often misunderstood as weakness. Promise me you'll protect what we built." He mentioned that he'd set up a living trust, one that allowed me full control over all our assets, but with clauses that protected against external claims or manipulative behavior from anyone outside the family. As I kept reading, my eyes widened. He'd even named a lawyer, Mr. Daniels, whom I remembered vaguely from a few years back. Harold had written, "If you ever feel someone is trying to control you or Isla, contact Mr. Daniels. He will know what to do." I sat there in silence, the letter shaking slightly in my hands. It felt like Harold was speaking to me across time, reminding me that he'd prepared for this moment. He'd known that I might one day need strength I didn't even realize I had. That realization filled me with a strange calm. Brandon thought he was clever, thought he could manipulate and belittle me, but my husband had already given me the tools to protect our legacy. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I called the number listed in the letter. To my surprise, Mr. Daniels still worked at the same firm. His voice was warm but professional. When I mentioned Harold's name, there was a brief pause before he said, "Mrs. Thompson, I was wondering when I might hear from you again. We scheduled an appointment for the following day. I didn't tell Isla, of course. I knew Brandon would find a way to twist the story if he got wind of it. Instead, I told them I was visiting an old friend from my nursing days. When I arrived at Mr. Daniel's office, he greeted me like an old acquaintance. His hair was grayer, his voice softer, but his eyes still sharp. I handed him the letter, and he nodded as he read it. Your husband was a very wise man, he said. Everything he set up is still valid. You have complete control over the estate, and you can make amendments as you see fit. Hearing those words sent a surge of quiet satisfaction through me. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't trapped. I had the power to decide who would benefit from Harold's legacy and who would be cut out entirely. We went over every document carefully. He explained that I could revise the trust to remove Brandon's name from future consideration, ensuring that if anything happened to me, he'd receive nothing, not even through Isla. But more than that, Mr. Daniels suggested adding a protective clause that would keep Isla's inheritance separate and inaccessible to her spouse. It's not uncommon, he said, especially when there's a concern about undue influence. I nodded. Let's do it, I told him, but quietly. We spent hours drafting, revising, and signing. With every signature, I felt stronger. Each pen stroke erased a piece of Brandon's control. When the final document was sealed, I sat back and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking my life back. As I left the office, I passed a small park down the street, the same one Harold and I used to walk through on Sunday afternoons. I stopped for a moment, watching children play on the swings, their laughter carried by the breeze. It was the kind of simple joy Harold had loved most. I could almost hear his voice in my head, calm and reassuring. You're doing the right thing, Miriam. Protect what matters. When I got home, I locked the new documents in my own safe, the one Brandon didn't even know existed. Then I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: power. Real, quiet, steady power. The kind of strength Brandon could never understand because it didn't come from dominance, it came from self-respect. I knew better than to confront him right away. This wasn't the time for shouting matches or dramatic declarations. No. I would let him believe he'd won. I would let him think I was still the same weak old woman he could push around. But deep down, I already knew I was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. By the time morning comes, Miriam has found her strength again and a way to use it. To teach him a lesson, I had to make Brandon believe I'd given up. Pretending to be weak was a skill I never thought I'd use, but sometimes the only way to beat arrogance is to feed it. Brandon thrived on control and validation he needed to feel superior. So, I gave him exactly that. I smiled more, agreed more, and questioned less. It was the perfect disguise. When I saw him next, I greeted him warmly, acting as though the birthday dinner hadn't left a scar. Brandon, I said with a pleasant tone, I've been thinking about what you said the other night. Maybe I have been trying to do too much alone. His grin widened instantly. Well, I'm glad you're seeing that, he replied, smugness dripping from every syllable. I told Isla you'd come around eventually. I bit my tongue to keep from laughing. Oh, I'd come around. All right, just not in the way he thought. From that moment, I began to play the part of the compliant, aging mother-in-law. I asked his advice on trivial things, like which phone plan I should switch to or which paint color might look better in the living room. Every time, he puffed up like a peacock, talking as if he were some kind of expert. Isla seemed relieved, mistaking my act for genuine peace. She started visiting more often again, always with Brandon in tow, but at least I got to see her smile, even if faintly. During one dinner, I made my helplessness more believable. Brandon, I said sweetly, you're so good with numbers. I've been thinking about simplifying some of my accounts. Maybe you could look at them for me? His eyes lit up. Of course, he said. I'll take care of it for you. He had no idea I was already 3 steps ahead of him. What I handed him that night wasn't my actual account information, it was a harmless decoy summary. Mr. Daniels helped me prepare. Watching him flip through it with feigned professionalism was almost entertaining. Meanwhile, I made sure to record small snippets of his arrogance whenever he let his guard down. It wasn't hard. Brandon had no filter when he felt powerful. He'd brag to Isla in front of me, saying things like, "Your mom's lucky I'm around." I mean, She can barely manage her own finances. Or, he'd joke about how I'd probably end up leaving everything to us anyway. I'd smile and nod, pressing record on my phone under the table. Isla seemed uncomfortable every time he said things like that. Her eyes would dart toward me, as if silently apologizing. I wanted to reach across the table and tell her it wasn't her fault that she'd fallen into the web of a man who used control as affection. But I couldn't. Not yet. Timing was everything, and my plan depended on patience. One weekend, I invited them to help me with a few repairs around the house. "I'm getting older," I said lightly, "and I think it's time I let someone else handle these little things." Brandon puffed out his chest. "Don't worry, Miriam, I'll take care of it." He strutted around my house, giving orders like he owned the place. He even made a comment about how this will all be ours someday, laughing as if it were harmless humor. Isla didn't laugh. She just looked down at her shoes. That was the moment I knew she was beginning to see it, the cracks in his charm, the manipulative pride that always needed feeding. Over the next few weeks, I continued my performance. I made him his favorite meals, praised his ambition, and even gifted him a tie for his birthday. The more I flattered him, the more careless he became. Brandon started talking freely about the future, bragging about what he'd do with the property and how he might invest the inheritance. He had no idea that I'd already erased him from every document that mattered. Denise, my ever-loyal friend, was the only one who knew what I was doing. "You're brilliant," she told me over coffee. "He'll never see it coming." I chuckled. "He thinks I'm a harmless old woman," I said. "Let him keep thinking that. His arrogance is the rope he's hanging himself with." But pretending wasn't easy. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I was doing the right thing. Harold had always taught me to be fair, to never seek revenge. But this wasn't about vengeance anymore, it was about balance. About dignity. Brandon had taken so much joy in belittling me and manipulating Isla. This was justice, quiet, and deserved. The turning point came during another family dinner at my house. Brandon was bragging about his new business venture, something vague about property flipping that sounded more like fantasy than reality. I smiled and asked, "Will you use some of the inheritance for that when the time comes?" His grin widened. "Of course. We'll make the money work for us. You won't have to worry about a thing, Miriam." I laughed softly. "Oh, I'm sure I won't." He took it as a compliment, not realizing it was the most honest statement I'd ever made to him. That night, as they left, he patted my shoulder. "You've come a long way, Miriam. I'm proud of you for finally trusting us with things." The sheer arrogance of it almost made me laugh out loud. I watched their car disappear down the street, then went inside, locking the door behind me. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the quiet glow of the lamp. My phone was filled with recordings, my documents were secure, and my will was exactly as Harold would have wanted it, untouched by greed. Brandon thought he was winning, but every time he spoke down to me, every time he mocked me or flaunted his imagined power, he was unknowingly sealing his own fate. Miriam smiles through dinner one evening, knowing his arrogance is digging his own grave. While Brandon thought I was knitting at home, I was actually sitting in my lawyer's office. It was a bright Tuesday morning when I decided it was time to make things official. I dressed carefully, navy skirt, cream blouse, and Harold's old watch on my wrist. That watch always made me feel grounded, like he was right there with me. I told Isla on the phone that I'd be staying in to catch up on laundry, and I could almost hear Brandon in the background, muttering something smug about how I was finally slowing down. If only he knew where I was really headed. Mr. Daniels' office was on the 4th floor of a modest downtown building. It smelled faintly of paper, coffee, old money, and quiet power. He greeted me with a warm smile and offered tea. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "you look more determined than last time." I smiled back. "I am," I said. "It's time to finish what Harold started." We spread the documents across his oak desk. He had already prepared the amendments we discussed earlier, removing Brandon's name entirely from any inheritance and protecting Isla's share in a separate trust that couldn't be accessed by her spouse under any circumstance. "You understand this means," he explained gently, "if your daughter stays married to him, he'll have no legal access to any of your estate, even indirectly." "That's exactly what I want," I said. "If she chooses to stay, that's her decision. But my husband's legacy will not fund her husband's arrogance." Mr. Daniels nodded approvingly. "You're making a wise move. I've seen this happen before, families torn apart by manipulation. Harold would be proud of you. His words brought a lump to my throat. I blinked away the emotion and focused on the paperwork. Every signature felt like closing a chapter of fear and opening one of control. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was protecting what Harold and I had built through decades of hard work, sacrifice, and love. When all the documents were signed, Mr. Daniels handed me a sealed folder. "Keep this safe," he said. "Only you have access to these records now. If anything ever happens, the instructions are crystal clear." I tucked the folder into my bag, feeling its weight a symbol of quiet power. Before I left, I hesitated. "Mr. Daniels," I said softly, "what happens if my daughter ever realizes the kind of man she married and decides to leave him? Can I adjust the trust again?" He smiled kindly. "Absolutely. You can revise it at any time. You're in full control." That reassurance settled something deep inside me. I wasn't helpless anymore. I was the one steering the ship, not Brandon, not fate, not anyone else. As I left the office, I stopped by the park across the street. The autumn air carried the scent of dry leaves and faint wood smoke. Children were playing on the swings, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. It reminded me of the days when Isla was little, when she'd run to Harold's arms, giggling, her hair flying behind her like a golden banner. Back then, our worries were simple. We had love, enough money to get by, and each other. I never thought the biggest threat to our family would come disguised as a son-in-law. I sat on a bench, pulled out my notebook, and wrote, "Control regained. Step 1 complete." It felt strange writing those words like an entry in a medical chart. Old habits die hard. But in that moment, documenting my actions made me feel alive again. Deliberate. Like I was rewriting the story Brandon tried to narrate for me. When I got home later that afternoon, the house felt different, lighter somehow. I put the documents in my personal safe behind the old bookshelf in the study. Brandon had been in my home many times, but he'd never think to look there. I'd watched him scan my furniture before, pretending to compliment it while really taking mental notes of what I owned. Men like him always assumed they were the smartest in the room. That arrogance would be his undoing. The next day, Brandon dropped by to check on things. He leaned against the doorway, wearing that insincere grin I'd come to recognize so well. "Hey, Miriam," he said casually. "Need me to take care of those property taxes for you? I remember you mentioned it was confusing." I smiled sweetly. "Oh, that's so kind of you to offer, Brandon. But I've already handled it. I went downtown yesterday and spoke to my lawyer." The flicker in his eyes was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. He wasn't expecting that. "Your lawyer?" he repeated, voice slightly tighter. "Everything okay?" "Perfectly fine," I said, my tone light. "Just making sure my affairs are in order. You know how it is at my age?" He forced a laugh, but I could see the discomfort crawling across his face. He didn't like the idea of me having legal help. He liked me dependent, confused, and trusting. I decided to give him a gentle nudge. "You never know when things might change," I added. "It's best to keep things secure." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Right, smart thinking, Miriam." Then he quickly changed the subject, pretending he wasn't unsettled. When he left, I watched him walk to his car, shoulders tense. For the first time, I could sense the faintest trace of unease in his perfect posture. It was small, but it was there, a crack in the armor. That evening, I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the fireplace. I thought about Harold again, about the letter he'd left for me. His foresight had given me everything I needed to defend myself and our daughter. I whispered to his photo, "Don't worry, love. I've got it under control." The firelight flickered against the framed pictures on the mantel, wedding photos, Isla's graduation, family vacations. They were reminders of a life built on love, not greed. I wasn't going to let Brandon's arrogance rewrite that history. From now on, he'd be walking through life thinking he'd won, thinking I'd surrendered. But I knew the truth. I'd just begun to fight, and I was winning without lifting a single weapon. For the first time in years, Miriam walks taller, her steps steady with purpose. The more I pretended to be weak, the stronger his insults became. Brandon was like a man intoxicated by his own power, unable to see that it was built on illusions. Every time I smiled sweetly or thanked him for helping me, he mistook it for surrender. In his mind, I had finally accepted my place, the frail old woman who needed his guidance. In reality, every word he spoke was another brick in the wall I was quietly building around him. It started with subtle jabs again. He'd drop by with that smug grin and say things like, "Don't worry, Miriam. I'll take care of this. You just relax." Or, "You're lucky to have me around, you wouldn't want to get confused with all this adult stuff." I'd nod and chuckle as if he were the most capable man alive. But inside, I was cataloging every remark, every expression, every slip of arrogance that revealed who he really was. At a neighborhood barbecue one weekend, he took things even further. I was chatting with my neighbor, Mrs. Carter, when Brandon strolled over with a beer in his hand. Out of nowhere, he announced, "I keep telling Miriam she needs to think about assisted living soon. It's too much for her to handle alone." The laughter that followed from a few acquaintances made my blood boil, but I didn't show it. I just smiled and said, "Oh, Brandon takes such good care of me. I don't know what I'd do without him." The satisfaction in his eyes was revolting but necessary. He had to keep believing I was harmless. When I got home that night, I wrote the incident in my notebook, underlined twice. "He enjoys public humiliation. Egotistical behavior escalating." The words looked clinical, but they helped me stay focused. This wasn't about feelings anymore, it was about evidence. Isla, meanwhile, seemed more distant than ever. When we did speak alone, she sounded tired, hesitant. "Brandon's just under a lot of stress, Mom," she'd say whenever I brought up his behavior. "He doesn't mean to sound harsh." I wanted to tell her that excuses only feed abuse, but I could see she wasn't ready to hear it. So instead, I said softly, "I know, sweetheart. Just remember, you deserve kindness." She went quiet, and for a moment, I thought I heard her sniffle. One afternoon, Brandon came over uninvited again, saying he wanted to help with my property taxes. I played my part perfectly. I thanked him and handed him an envelope filled with what he thought were financial documents. They weren't, Mr. Daniels and I had prepared dummy papers for this very scenario. Everything inside looked legitimate but had no actual financial information. He leafed through the pages, pretending to understand every number, and said, "Good thing I'm here, Miriam. Most of this stuff would go right over your head." I forced a small laugh and poured him coffee, though I was tempted to throw it in his lap. "You're such a blessing," I said. He smiled proudly, oblivious that he was holding a stack of useless paper. That evening, I received a text from Isla. "Brandon said he's taking care of your taxes for you. That's so sweet of him." I stared at my phone for a long moment before replying, "Yes, he's been very helpful." The words burned on the screen, but they were part of the plan. The more confident he felt, the less careful he'd be. And indeed, his arrogance ballooned over the next few weeks. He began speaking over me during family dinners, cutting me off mid-sentence with comments like, "What she means to say is," or, "Don't worry, I've already handled it." Isla's discomfort grew visible. Her smiles no longer reached her eyes. But she still said nothing. Brandon's control over her wasn't physical, it was emotional. He'd convinced her that questioning him meant disloyalty. Denise noticed it too. One afternoon when she stopped by for tea, she said quietly, "You're doing the right thing. But be careful, Miriam. Men like that, they lash out when they sense they're losing control." I nodded. "That's why he can't know anything. He has to think he's winning." A week later, Brandon came over with a proposal. He wanted to convince me to put my property under joint supervision for convenience. He framed it as a safety measure in case something happened to me. I listened patiently, nodding as he talked about managing things efficiently. Inside, my stomach churned. He was trying to legally insert himself into my life. When he finished, I clasped my hands together and smiled. "You're so thoughtful, Brandon," I said softly. "But I think I'll wait a bit longer before making big changes. You know me, I take my time." He didn't like that answer. I saw a flicker of irritation in his eyes. He covered it with a laugh, but I caught it. He leaned closer and said, "Don't wait too long, Miriam. You might forget to do it." I smiled sweetly. "Oh, I won't forget." The next day, I made another note in my journal. "He's getting greedy, overconfident, perfect timing approaching." I continued playing my role to perfection. I baked him cookies, asked about his business ideas, and even let him teach me how to use online banking, which, of course, was just a fake account Mr. Daniels helped me set up. Every time he explained something basic like it was rocket science, I nodded in awe. and he practically glowed with self-satisfaction. He was so blinded by his ego that he never noticed how Isla's demeanor began to shift. She watched his arrogance grow too, and I could see the confusion in her eyes, the realization that maybe her husband wasn't as admirable as she once believed. I didn't push it. I knew she needed to see it for herself. By then, I'd already set everything in motion. My documents were sealed, my lawyer was on standby, and all that remained was to let Brandon reveal his true nature publicly so that no one, not even Isla, could deny it. Miriam watches silently, knowing the real paperwork already sealed his fate. When I invited everyone for Sunday lunch, I made sure Brandon's ego would do the talking. It had been nearly 2 months since I finalized the trust, and I'd kept my composure flawlessly. Brandon thought he had me wrapped neatly around his finger. He bragged openly now about handling my finances, about advising me on investments, about how the family estate would be in good hands once I was gone. His arrogance had grown too large to contain, and I was ready to use it against him. I decided to host a proper family gathering, a Sunday lunch like Harold used to love. I told Isla I wanted to reconnect with everyone, to make peace and show that there were no hard feelings after that awkward birthday dinner. Isla seemed relieved, hopeful even. "Brandon will be happy to hear that," she said. "He's been wanting things to feel normal again." I smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm sure he has." I invited not just Isla and Brandon, but a few close relatives, Harold's brother and his wife, 2 of my cousins, and even Denise, who I introduced as an old friend of the family. I also extended a discreet invitation to Mr. Daniels, my lawyer, asking him to drop by for coffee after lunch. He agreed, understanding exactly why I wanted him there. That Sunday, the house was filled with the warm scent of roasted chicken, herbs, and baked bread. The table gleamed under the chandelier, set with the good china I hadn't used in years. Every detail was deliberate. I wanted everything to look peaceful, comfortable, familiar because Brandon thrived when he felt in control. When they arrived, Brandon walked in first, wearing his usual fake smile and confidence like a tailored suit. "Well, this is a nice surprise," he said, kissing my cheek. "Guess you're not mad at me anymore, huh?" I laughed softly. "Mad? Oh, not at all. Life's too short for grudges." As the meal began, conversation flowed easily. I talked about the garden, Harold's favorite recipes, and even complimented Brandon's supposed business achievements. He was radiant with self-importance, holding court at the table as if he were the host. Isla smiled politely, but I could see the discomfort behind her eyes. Halfway through lunch, I decided it was time to drop the first bait. I poured a bit more wine into my glass and said casually, "I've been finalizing my will and estate plans lately. I just want to make sure everything's in order before I get too old to think straight." I laughed, pretending it was a harmless joke. That one sentence was all it took. Brandon leaned forward, curiosity gleaming in his eyes. "Oh yeah?" he said with a grin. "That's great, Miriam. It's good to plan ahead." He turned to the others and chuckled. "You know, I keep telling her I'll handle things once she's gone. I mean, someone has to keep all this from falling apart, right?" A few relatives shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the sound of his own voice. I tilted my head and asked innocently, "Oh? And what would you do with it all, Brandon?" He smirked, swirling his wine like a man rehearsing for a victory toast. "Well, I'd probably renovate this place. It's nice, but it could use some modern touches. Maybe turn part of it into a home office or something. I've got plans." The silence that followed was sharp. My cousin looked at me with raised eyebrows. Denise hid a smile behind her napkin. I gave a soft chuckle, as though amused. "That's interesting. You've really thought it through." Brandon grinned proudly. "Of course. You've got a plan for the future." That was my cue. I turned toward the kitchen door and called out, "Mr. Daniels, would you bring the coffee, please?" He entered the dining room a moment later, holding a tray. Brandon froze mid-sentence, confused. "Wait," he said slowly. "What's your lawyer doing here?" I smiled. "Oh, Brandon, I wanted him to join us for dessert. After all, he's been helping me with those will and trust updates I mentioned earlier." I could see the color drain from Brandon's face. "Oh," he said, trying to sound casual. "I didn't realize you'd already finalized things." "Yes," I said sweetly. "Everything's signed, sealed, and filed. Mr. Daniels has been wonderful about making sure my husband's wishes were honored exactly as intended." Brandon tried to recover, laughing awkwardly. Well, that's great. I'm sure everything's in good hands. Mr. Daniels set the tray down and looked around politely. Indeed it is, he said. Your late husband made provisions for his wife's independence and her right to adjust the estate as she saw fit. Mrs. Thompson's updates are quite clear and very protective. Brandon's grin faltered. Protective? What do you mean? Mr. Daniels smiled politely, folding his hands. Simply that all assets have been secured in a trust. They are now inaccessible to anyone outside Mrs. Thompson's immediate control. Her daughter remains a beneficiary, of course, but her spouse has no legal claim now or in the future. The room went silent. Forks hovered midair. Brandon blinked, his face stiff. Wait, what? He said, his voice a mix of disbelief and outrage. I sipped my coffee calmly. Oh, don't look so shocked, Brandon. I thought you'd be happy for me. After all, you said it yourself, I shouldn't try to handle things alone. So I got professional help. Denise hid a smirk behind her glass. My relatives glanced awkwardly at one another, sensing the shift. Isla's face had gone pale. She stared at me, then at her husband, confusion flooding her eyes. Brandon's voice rose slightly. So what, you just took me out of the will? You can't do that. I set my cup down gently. Oh, I can. And I did. Harold made sure of it when he set up our estate. I'm simply following his example. For a moment, I thought he might explode. His fists clenched under the table, his jaw tightened, and his chest heaved with silent fury. But surrounded by family, with all eyes on him, he forced a strained laugh. Wow, he said. Didn't see that coming. I smiled. I know you didn't. No one else spoke for a long moment. The atmosphere had shifted completely, the power that Brandon once wielded had vanished in an instant. He looked smaller somehow, deflated. As the gathering ended, he muttered something about needing to take a call, and left the table abruptly. I watched him through the window, pacing outside, gesturing angrily on his phone. Inside, the others began murmuring, quietly congratulating me for standing my ground. But I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. There was still more truth for him to face, and I had no intention of letting him off easy. The room falls silent as Brandon's face turns pale and speechless. For a man who mocked me for being weak, he suddenly looked very small. After that Sunday lunch, the calm in my house felt different. It wasn't peace, it was the silence before a storm. Brandon had left in a hurry, and I could practically see the rage simmering behind his polite facade as he closed the door. Isla lingered for a few minutes, clearly torn. She hugged me softly before leaving, whispering, I'll call you tomorrow. But I knew that when she got home, that call wouldn't be easy. Sure enough, the next morning came with a pounding knock at my front door. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. Brandon stood there, jaw tight, fists clenched, eyes wild with the fury of a man whose pride had been shattered. We need to talk, he said through gritted teeth. I folded my arms calmly. About what? You humiliated me, he spat. In front of everyone. You made me look like a fool. I looked him dead in the eye. You didn't need my help for that, Brandon. His nostrils flared, and for a moment, I thought he might step forward. But he stopped himself. He wasn't stupid enough to cross that line. You had no right to do what you did, he growled. You can't just erase people from wills because you're having a bad day. I didn't erase people, I said evenly. I erased one man. A man who disrespects me, manipulates my daughter, and calls me weak. And I assure you, it wasn't done in a day, it was planned carefully. His expression twisted with disbelief. You think this is funny? You think you can play games with me? No, Brandon, I replied softly. I think you've been playing games for years. I just decided not to play along anymore. He fell silent, his breathing heavy. Then, in a low, cold voice, he said, You'll regret this. I tilted my head. The only thing I regret is not doing it sooner. He turned sharply and stormed off the porch, muttering under his breath. I watched him get into his car, slamming the door so hard it made the windows shake. But even then, I didn't feel fear, just clarity. That afternoon, Isla called. Her voice was trembling. Mom, what happened? Brandon's furious. He said you embarrassed him in front of everyone. I didn't embarrass him, sweetheart. He did that himself. She hesitated. He says you're trying to drive a wedge between us. I sighed. No, Isla. He's the wedge. I'm just trying to lift it out before it breaks you. There was silence on the line. Then a quiet sob. I don't know what to do, she whispered. Do what's right for you, I said gently. But remember what your father always told you, respect is not a request. It's a requirement. After that call, things got worse before they got better. Brandon stopped pretending to be civil. He called repeatedly, sometimes shouting, sometimes threatening to contest everything once I was gone. I stopped answering. When he showed up at my door a second time, I refused to open it. I watched from the window as he stood there for 10 minutes, pacing and muttering to himself, before driving away. I called Mr. Daniels later that day. He's angry, I told him. Can he actually contest the will? Not successfully, Mr. Daniels assured me. Your documents are airtight. His behavior, however, may become unpredictable. Stay cautious. That night, I double-checked the locks and left a small lamp burning in the living room. The house felt eerily quiet, like Harold's spirit was sitting with me in silent solidarity. I whispered to his photograph. I did what we had to do. Over the next week, Brandon tried new tactics. He called Isla constantly, twisting the story, making himself the victim. Your mom's trying to ruin us, he'd say. She's manipulating you. Isla's voice cracked when she told me. He won't stop, Mom. He keeps saying you're going senile, that you're making rash decisions. Sweetheart, I said, my voice steady. That's what bullies do when they lose control. They rewrite the story. Isla came over a few days later, alone. Her eyes were puffy from crying. I don't know who he is anymore, she said, collapsing into a chair. He won't listen, he just keeps shouting about money and family loyalty. I sat beside her and held her hand. He's showing you who he really is, Isla. Believe him. She nodded slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks. He said he'd fix this, she whispered. That's what he said when he stormed out of the house that night. Fix this, I repeated softly. He's the only thing broken here. The following weekend, Brandon sent me a long email. It was half apology, half accusation. He blamed stress, misunderstandings, and outside influence. He wrote, I'm just trying to protect Isla and the future of this family. I don't understand why you're shutting me out. The hypocrisy nearly made me laugh. I didn't respond. Days later, Isla called again. He's furious you're ignoring him, she said. He's saying he'll talk to your lawyer, himself. I couldn't help but smile. Let him try. He did try twice, in fact. Both times, Mr. Daniels' secretary turned him away, explaining that I was the only authorized client. Each rejection only made him angrier. Isla told me he'd started drinking more, ranting late into the night about how the old woman was ruining everything. Through it all, I stayed calm. I'd faced sickness, loss, and grief in my life. Brandon's tantrums were nothing compared to that. He could huff and puff all he wanted, but my house, my will, and my dignity were built on foundations far stronger than his ego. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew he wasn't done. Men like him never leave quietly. They always have one last trick, one last desperate move. But this time, I was ready. Every document, every recording, every note in my journal was a shield. And there was one piece of evidence he didn't know existed, something that would end his manipulations for good. But what he doesn't know is that Miriam has one more move prepared. He thought I was just a harmless old woman with no proof, but I had everything. For months, I'd been documenting every sneer, every insult, every manipulative phrase that came from Brandon's mouth. What he never realized was that I'd recorded him multiple times, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes when he least expected it. His arrogance blinded him completely. He believed I was too naive to use technology beyond email, yet I'd been saving digital evidence of his behavior since the first time he disrespected me. It began innocently enough, a video clip of him joking that I'd probably forget where my wallet was one day. But over time, I collected dozens of moments like that. The recordings weren't just insults. They were confessions, bits of conversation where he bragged about controlling Isla's finances, mocking her, and even laughing about how old people were easy to manipulate. After the confrontation about the will, I went through those recordings one by one. My living room was silent except for the sound of his voice echoing through my phone. Your mom's too soft, he said in one clip. You've got to handle her before she messes everything up. In another, he told a friend over speakerphone. Once she's gone, I'll make sure the money's put to better use. Isla won't even have to deal with it. Listening to those words turned my stomach. But they also fueled something deeper, a sense of vindication. The truth was no longer just my word against his. I had proof, clear and undeniable. I organized the recordings by date, labeling each file carefully. My nursing background had taught me the value of documentation. Every incident, every detail, every timestamp mattered. Once everything was neatly arranged, I called Mr. Daniels and asked for a private appointment. When I arrived, I handed him a small flash drive. "Everything you need to understand Brandon is on here," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Is this what I think it is?" I nodded. Recordings, statements, all voluntary on his part. Mr. Daniels listened to a few samples, his expression hardening with every sentence. "This is damning," he said finally. "It shows manipulation, intent, and verbal abuse. If your daughter ever decides to separate from him, this will protect her from losing a cent." "That's exactly what I want," I replied. "I don't want revenge, Mr. Daniels. I just want to make sure Isla has a chance to be free if she ever chooses to walk away." He smiled slightly. "You're not weak, Mrs. Thompson. You're one of the most strategic women I've met." I chuckled softly. "Funny." Brandon said the opposite. "We stored a copy of the recordings in the firm's secure archive, and I kept another at home, hidden inside a sewing box where no one would think to look. It gave me comfort knowing that no matter what lies Brandon tried to spread, the truth was safe, backed up, and ready." Not long after, the cracks in his perfect image started to widen. Isla called me late one evening, her voice trembling. "Mom," she said quietly, "I don't know what to do anymore. He's angry all the time. He keeps saying you're trying to ruin his life. He even went through my phone last night." "Sweetheart," I said gently, "I need you to come by tomorrow. There's something I want you to hear." When she arrived, she looked exhausted. Her eyes were red, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her purse. I led her to the kitchen table and poured her some tea. Then, without saying a word, I pressed play on one of the recordings. It was Brandon's voice, dripping with contempt. "Your mom's pathetic, Isla. She'll be gone soon enough, and then we can do things my way. She doesn't deserve what she has." Isla froze. I watched her face change shock, then realization, then heartbreak. Her hand covered her mouth as the recording continued, Brandon laughing as he bragged about manipulating me. When it ended, she sat in silence for a long time, staring at the table. Finally, she whispered, "He really said that?" I nodded. "There's more, much more." I showed her another clip where he told a friend that marrying Isla was an investment. By the time it ended, tears streamed down her cheeks. "I thought he loved me," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart," I said softly. "He made you believe that. But real love doesn't need control. Real love doesn't tear you down to build itself up." She reached across the table and grabbed my hand, her grip tight. "Thank you for showing me," she said through tears. I didn't want to believe it, but now I can't unhear it. Over the next week, Isla stayed with me. She barely spoke, spending most of her time staring out the window, processing everything she'd just learned. Then one morning, she came into the kitchen dressed neatly, her hair pulled back, a calm determination in her eyes. "I called a lawyer," she said. "I'm filing for separation." My chest tightened, not with sadness, but with pride. My daughter had found her courage again. When Brandon received the notice, he exploded. He called repeatedly, left angry messages, even showed up at her workplace. But this time, Isla didn't bend. She changed her number, blocked his accounts, and told her employer about the situation. She also gave a copy of the recordings to her attorney, which effectively silenced Brandon's threats. Word spread quickly through his circle. His business partners distanced themselves after hearing the clips. The same mouth that had spewed arrogance had now become his undoing. He wasn't the confident man with the winning smile anymore. He was just another bully exposed by his own words. I watched all of it unfold quietly, not celebrating, just breathing. It wasn't triumph. I felt it was closure. Brandon's downfall wasn't something I needed to orchestrate further. He'd already destroyed himself with his pride. The man who once called her weak now has nowhere to stand. When Isla finally came back home, she looked like a woman reborn. The weight she had carried for years was gone from her shoulders, and though the road behind her was jagged, her steps were steady. She stood on my porch that morning with a small overnight bag and a soft smile that told me everything I needed to know. She was finally free. She had filed for divorce 3 days earlier. The process was exhausting and painful, but she'd done it with quiet strength. I'd been there beside her through every document, every phone call, every tear she wiped away before signing her name. She had walked away from Brandon's house, his lies, and his control without looking back. The recordings we'd gathered had made it impossible for him to fight her in court. Once his lawyer, if heard even one, they advised him to settle immediately. He had no leverage anymore. When Isla came inside, she wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "It's over." Those 2 words brought tears to my eyes. For years I'd prayed she would see the truth for herself. I didn't force her. I simply waited, hoping that one day she'd remember the strong woman she used to be. Now, here she was, standing in the same kitchen where she once cried over Brandon's excuses, finally at peace. We sat together at the table, the morning sunlight spilling across the room. I poured her a cup of tea, just like I used to when she was a teenager after a long day at school. She smiled faintly. "I can't believe I let it get that far," she said. "I thought I was doing the right thing, being a good wife, being patient, being understanding." I took her hand gently. "You were doing what good people do, Isla. You gave him chances. You trusted him. That's not weakness, it's humanity. But there comes a time when patience becomes permission, and you finally realize that." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "He made me feel like I was nothing without him, Mom. Like every decision I made was wrong." I stopped recognizing myself. I reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "That's what control looks like, sweetheart. It doesn't always shout, it whispers, and it makes you doubt your own voice. But now you've found it again." For a moment, she smiled. Truly smiled. And I saw a glimpse of the girl she once was, the confident, bright, unstoppable Isla who had dreams bigger than any small-minded man could understand. She sipped her tea and said softly, "You were right all along. You saw it before I did." I sighed. A mother always does. But sometimes, knowing isn't enough. You have to wait for the heart to catch up to what the mind already knows. The next few weeks were a quiet kind of healing. Isla stayed with me while the papers were processed. She took long walks, cooked with me, even helped me tend to the garden Harold had once planted. I could see her rebuilding herself piece by piece, moment by moment. The anger that had once consumed her had faded, replaced by a calm resolve. One evening, as we were preparing dinner together, she said, "You know, Brandon called me one last time before I blocked him. He said he forgave me for listening to you." She rolled her eyes and laughed bitterly. "Forgave me. As if I needed his permission to start breathing again." I smiled softly. "He'll keep telling himself that. Men like him need to rewrite their failures into stories where they're the victims. Let him. The truth doesn't need his approval." After dinner, we sat outside on the porch, watching the sunset. The air smelled of lilacs and fresh grass, the same scent that used to drift through the yard when Harold was alive. Isla leaned her head on my shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner, Mom." I wrapped my arm around her. "Don't apologize. You had to see it yourself. Now that you have, you'll never fall for that kind of love again." She nodded, and for a long time, we sat in silence, watching the sky shift from gold to deep violet. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about her. I wasn't waiting for the next phone call filled with tears or excuses. She was healing. A few days later, we visited Harold's grave together. Isla placed fresh flowers on the headstone white lilies, his favorite, and whispered something under her breath. I didn't ask what she said, but I saw peace settle across her face. I stood beside her, my hand resting on her shoulder, and felt a sense of closure ripple through us both. "Dad would be proud of you," I said quietly. She smiled through her tears. "He'd be proud of you too. You saved me, Mom." I shook my head. "No, Isla. You saved yourself. I just left the light on so you could find your way back." We stayed there until the sun dipped below the trees. The world hushed except for the faint rustle of wind through the leaves. When we finally walked back to the car, Isla looked lighter, like a burden had lifted from her that she didn't even realize she'd been carrying for years. From that day forward, I noticed small but beautiful changes in her. She started smiling more. She reconnected with old friends. She took a job at a local nonprofit, helping women who were rebuilding their lives after difficult relationships. "I think I know a thing or two about that," she said with a wink. Watching her bloom again was the greatest reward I could have asked for. Brandon had tried to break her, to convince her that strength was selfish, but instead, she became stronger than ever. That night, as I tucked away the last of the legal paperwork, I glanced at Harold's picture and whispered, "She's safe now. You can rest easy." Miriam silently realizes her husband's plan worked better than he ever imagined. Before I finalized the last version of my will, I wrote one final letter. It wasn't a legal document, not something for lawyers or courts to handle. This was something for Isla. Something personal. Something she would open only after I was gone, when my voice could no longer reach her, but my words still could. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with a cup of tea beside me, a soft melody playing from the old record player Harold had loved. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock and the whisper of pen against paper. I started the letter simply, just as Harold used to when he wrote to me during our early years together. "My dearest Isla." I told her that the will, the trust, the plans, all of it had never been about revenge. It had been about protection, about love. I explained how Harold, years before he passed, had created a plan to safeguard what we'd built, not from strangers, but from those who might forget that. Respect is the foundation of family. I wrote, "I wanted you to learn something important, Isla. The world will often mistake kindness for weakness. Don't let it change who you are, but don't let it make you a fool either. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles politely and walks away." I paused then, staring at the half-filled page. Writing this letter felt heavier than anything I'd done before. Every word carried the weight of years of mistakes, forgiveness, endurance. I wanted her to understand me, not as her mother, but as a woman who had lived, loved, and learned the hard way. "When your father died," I wrote, "I thought my life ended too. But then I saw you, still so young, still so full of light, and I knew I had to keep going. You gave me purpose again. You are my greatest joy and my proudest accomplishment. I may not be here to guide you forever, but everything I've done from protecting our home to standing up for myself was to remind you that you have that same strength within you." I told her about Harold's foresight, about how he had planned for this long before I even understood what he was doing. I wanted her to know that she came from two people who believed in her, who saw in her a courage that could withstand anything. Then, I wrote about Brandon, not his name, but his type. There will always be people who see your light and try to dim it so theirs can shine brighter. Let them go. You cannot teach someone respect by allowing them to hurt you. Walk away, even if your heart trembles. One day, that trembling will become peace. I sealed those words with tears that I didn't mean to shed. They weren't tears of sadness, but of release. Everything I'd carried, the pain, the fear, the guilt, was finally being poured out onto that page. I ended the letter by reminding her that forgiveness isn't about letting others off the hook. It's about freeing yourself. If you ever read this, my darling girl, know that I forgave him long ago, not because he deserved it, but because I refused to let bitterness stain the last years of my life. I hope you will do the same, and live unburdened. When I finished, I folded the letter neatly and slipped it into an envelope marked "For Isla," to be opened after my time. I placed it inside the safe beside Harold's old letters. Somehow, knowing it was there made me feel peaceful. It wasn't just about inheritance or property, it was about leaving behind the truth of who we were, the story behind the signatures and clauses. Later that night, I stepped outside with a blanket and sat on the porch. The moon was full, bathing the garden in silver light. I looked at the flowers Isla had planted weeks ago, vibrant reds and yellows blooming in soft defiance of the coming autumn. Life continues, I thought, always, even after the worst storms. Denise called around that time, checking in as she often did. When I told her about the letter, she sighed happily. "You've done everything you could, Miriam. You've secured the future, and you've healed the past. That's a rare thing. I just wanted her to understand me," I said quietly. "Not as her mother, but as a woman who refused to stay silent." "She will," Denise replied. "And when she does, she'll realize she was raised by a warrior who never had to raise her voice to win." After the call, I went back inside and looked at the framed photos on the mantel. Harold's smile seemed softer that night, less like a memory and more like reassurance. I whispered, "It's done, my love. Everything's in place." Then I turned off the lights, feeling the stillness of the house settle around me like a blanket. I wasn't lonely anymore. I had my peace, my dignity, and my daughter's strength blooming where fear once lived. The next morning, I found Isla in the garden, humming to herself as she watered the plants. She looked serene, radiant even. For the first time in years, I didn't see the girl who needed saving, I saw a woman who had found her own power. I smiled to myself, knowing that one day, when she read that letter, she'd understand every decision I made. She'd know that love, when pure and steady, doesn't always look soft. Sometimes it looks like resolve. Sometimes it looks like a pen writing quietly in the middle of the night, leaving behind a message for the next generation. And deep down, she knows she's finally free of the man who once belittled her. Months later, he showed up at my doorstep looking nothing like the man he used to be. It was early spring when Brandon returned. The air was crisp, and my garden had just started to bloom again. I was pruning the rose bushes when I heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel. For a moment, I thought it might be Isla coming by early for lunch, but when I looked up, my breath caught. There he was, Brandon, standing at the edge of my driveway, his expensive car coated in dust, his suit wrinkled, his face drawn and tired. He looked like a man who had lost everything, and I suppose in many ways he had. I straightened slowly, setting down the shears. "What are you doing here, Brandon?" I asked. My voice was calm, but inside, I felt that old unease flicker for the briefest moment. He gave a small, forced laugh. "You look good, Miriam. Really good." His voice was soft, almost pleading. It was jarring hearing it without the arrogance that used to coat every word. "I didn't ask how I looked," I said. "I asked why you're here." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his unkempt hair. I wanted to apologize. I know I've made mistakes. Things have been really hard lately. The business fell apart. People stopped trusting me. I lost everything, Miriam." I studied him silently. There was no satisfaction in seeing him broken. Just a kind of hollow understanding that this was the natural consequence of his own actions. "You didn't lose everything," I said finally. "You gave it away, one lie at a time." He flinched, his eyes darting to the ground. I know I hurt Isla. I hurt you too. But I swear, I've changed. I'm not that person anymore." The desperation in his voice was almost pitiful. He looked thinner, his confidence stripped bare. His hands shook slightly as he spoke. "I've been going to therapy," he continued quickly, as though rushing to convince me. "I'm trying to be better. I wanted to come here and make things right. Maybe you could talk to Isla for me? Just to let her know I'm sorry?" I folded my arms. "You don't need me for that. If you truly want to apologize, you'll do it without expecting forgiveness in return." He shook his head, eyes wide. "She won't even answer my calls. She won't talk to me. You're the only one she listens to." A quiet sadness crept over me, not for him, but for the man he could have been if he hadn't let his pride destroy him. "Brandon," I said gently, "when you destroy someone's trust, an apology doesn't rebuild it. It's just an echo in an empty room." He looked up, tears glistening in his eyes. "I was scared," he said. "Scared of losing control. Scared of not being enough. I thought if I took charge of everything I'd be safe, but I was wrong." I nodded slowly. "You were. You mistook control for love, and fear for power. And now you know what both truly cost." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, and the faint chirping of birds filled the silence. Brandon wiped his face with the back of his hand, his voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I just needed to say it to say I'm sorry." I looked at him carefully. The man who once stood in my dining room mocking me for being weak now looked like a boy who'd lost his way. "Forgiveness isn't something I withhold," I said softly. "I forgave you the moment I decided you'd no longer have power over me. But that doesn't mean you're welcome back into our lives." He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "So, that's it then?" "Yes," I said firmly. "That's it." He looked around at the house, his eyes lingering on the garden, the windows, the life that had moved on without him. "You really are strong," he murmured. "Stronger than I ever gave you credit for." "I always was," I replied. "You just never bothered to look closely enough to see it." For a moment, he stood there, as if trying to think of something else to say. Then he gave a weak smile. "Tell Isla I'm proud of her, and tell her I hope she finds someone better than me." I nodded, though I didn't promise anything. "Goodbye, Brandon." He hesitated one last time, then turned and walked back to his car. His steps were slow, heavy, as if each one took more effort than the last. I watched as he started the engine, the car sputtering before pulling away. He didn't look back once. When the sound of the tires faded down the road, I stood there for a while, breathing in the cool air. There was no triumph in his downfall, only quiet closure. Sometimes, victory doesn't look like celebration. Sometimes, it's simply peace returning to a place where chaos once lived. I went inside, closed the door, and leaned against it for a moment. The house was still, the kind of stillness that feels sacred. On the mantel, Harold's photo caught the sunlight, his familiar smile seeming to say, "You did it." Later that evening, Isla came by for dinner. As we sat down, I told her about Brandon's visit. She listened quietly, then said, "I'm glad he came. I don't hate him anymore. I just don't need him." I smiled, proud of her growth. "That's how you know you've healed," I said. We ate in peace, the kind that had taken years to earn. I realized then that the story was no longer about what Brandon had done to us, it was about what we'd done for ourselves. Miriam closes the door behind him, feeling the final chapter settle into place. People used to tell me I was too gentle for my own good, but now I know better. The quiet in my house these days isn't lonely anymore, it's peaceful. The same walls that once echoed with tension now carry only laughter, music, and the gentle hum of life moving forward. I've learned that peace isn't the absence of chaos, it's the refusal to let it live inside you. It's been nearly a year since Brandon left our lives for good. He never tried to come back after that last visit. I suppose even he understood that there was nothing left to gain from returning. Sometimes, I still think of him not with anger, but with a kind of distant pity. He was a man who never understood that real strength doesn't come from control. It comes from restraint. Isla has changed so much since then. She's stronger, lighter, freer. She moved into a small apartment nearby, started her own business helping other women who've gone through controlling relationships, and even joined a local support network to speak about her experience. Every time I see her talk to those women, steady voice, kind eyes, shoulders squared, I feel a quiet swell of pride. She's not just surviving anymore, she's thriving. One afternoon I visited her office. The walls were covered with photos and inspirational quotes, but one in particular caught my eye. "Strength is not loud, it's consistent." She told me she'd chosen it because it reminded her of me. I smiled and said, "You've made it your own now. We meet every week for Sunday tea, just as we used to. Only now, our conversations are full of laughter again. We talk about work, books, travel plans, normal things. The shadows of the past don't linger in every sentence anymore. They've become lessons instead of scars. My own days are simple but full. I volunteer twice a week at a women's center downtown, sharing my story with those who need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim yourself. Some of the women are young, barely in their 20s, others are closer to my age. When I tell them how my son-in-law once called me weak, they laugh at first, thinking it's just a cruel remark. Then I tell them how I took control quietly, deliberately, and how I didn't need revenge to feel powerful. I only needed peace. Their faces change then. They see themselves in me, and I see myself in them. One woman once asked, "Weren't you scared, Mrs. Thompson, doing all that alone?" I smiled and said, "Of course. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite it. When I come home from the center, I tend to my garden, the same one Harold planted years ago. The roses are fuller now, the soil richer. I like to think that's symbolic. Growth always follows pruning. Sometimes, as I water the plants, I can almost hear Harold's voice teasing me for overwatering them. I'll look up at the sky and whisper, 'I'm doing just fine, love. You'd be proud.' Inside, my home feels lighter. The photos on the wall are reminders of the life I built, not just with Harold, but with Isla, and now with the women I've met through my work. I've stopped seeing myself as a widow or a victim. I'm simply Miriam, strong, whole, and at peace. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Isla came over with a framed photo. It was one of us from years ago, me holding her on her graduation day, both of us laughing uncontrollably because Harold had made a terrible joke right before the picture was taken. She set it on the mantel and said, "This belongs here." I smiled and nodded. "It does." We sat together on the couch, sipping tea and watching the fire dance in the fireplace. After a moment, Isla said, "You know, Mom, I used to think you were fragile. I think that's why I didn't defend you when Brandon said those awful things. But now I see it. You were never fragile. You were just patient. Her words caught me off guard. I turned to her, eyes glistening. Patience is its own kind of power. Sweetheart, it waits quietly, then strikes when the moment is right. She smiled. I learned that from the best. Later that night, after she left, I stood by the window and looked out at the garden. The moonlight shimmered on the flowers, and the air was cool and still. I thought about everything that had happened, the insults, the manipulation, the sleepless nights, the letters, the confrontation. Every step of that journey had led me here, to this quiet strength, to this unshakable peace. People like Brandon come and go, but dignity once reclaimed stays. I used to think I needed to prove my strength, but now I understand I never had to. It was there all along, rooted deep inside, waiting for me to remember it. As I turned away from the window, I caught sight of Harold's old photograph again. His smile, kind and knowing, seemed to say what I already felt in my heart, that I had honored him, honored myself, and protected what mattered most, our family's spirit. I blew out the last candle on the mantel, and the room dimmed into a soft glow. My home was quiet, but not silent. It was alive with peace. They called me weak, but in the end, I was the strongest one in the room.